They almost succeeded in erasing what happened in the small German town of Winden in 1946. The war was over, the world was broken, and everyone wanted to forget. But there are some things too dark to stay buried, no matter how many names are changed or files burned. It started with a man named Friedrich Rau, a respected doctor who'd served as a military physician during the final years of the war. When he returned home, he opened a small clinic on the edge of town, offering free treatment for families who'd lost everything. To the townspeople, he was a hero, a quiet, kind man trying to bring a touch of decency back to a ruined place. But those who lived near his clinic noticed strange things. At night, lights stayed on long after midnight. The hum of generators could be heard through the forest, and sometimes faint cries, brief, strangled, and quickly silenced. People convinced themselves it was just the wind. After years of war, they'd learned not to ask questions. In 1948, a group of children discovered something while playing near the edge of Rau's property. A buried trunk, rusted shut. They thought it might contain old army weapons or supplies. When they pried it open, the smell hit first, sweet and metallic. Inside were glass jars, neatly labeled, each containing preserved human eyes. Dozens of them. The police were called, and Friedrich Rau was arrested that same day. What followed should have been the story of a nation confronting its horror. But it wasn't. The investigation was brief. The trial was closed to the public. And within weeks, the story vanished from the papers. Years later, a young journalist named Anna Weiss uncovered what had really happened. She had grown up hearing whispers about the doctor in the woods, and when she began digging through archives for her university thesis, she found a sealed file marked with a red cross and the word Vergessen, to be forgotten. Inside were transcripts of Rau's interrogation. He'd confessed, in a detached clinical tone, to performing continuation experiments. During the war, he'd worked on a secret program studying trauma-induced blindness, an effort to understand the effects of terror on the human nervous system. His victims weren't soldiers. They were civilians. When the Third Reich collapsed, Rau escaped the tribunals by falsifying his records. He reinvented himself as a humanitarian, using his medical license and war connections to hide in plain sight. But what he continued in Winden was even worse. He wasn't studying blindness anymore. He was trying to erase memories. The local cemetery keeper testified that Rau often requested unclaimed bodies for medical research. When none were available, people from neighboring towns began disappearing. Refugees, vagrants, anyone who wouldn't be missed. In his lab, investigators found shelves of chemicals, surgical notes, and a wall covered in black and white photographs. Patients with shaved heads staring blankly into the camera. Each photo had a number instead of a name. Beneath them, handwritten notes read, "Memory degradation, 67%. Emotional response suppressed. Success, subject unrecognizable to self." Rau claimed his work was about mercy. To remove memory, he said, is to remove pain. He believed he could heal trauma by destroying the self. When police raided the lab, they found 8 patients still alive. Their bodies bore surgical scars across the scalp and spine. When asked who they were, none could answer. They didn't remember their names, their families, or even their language. They stared at the investigators with empty eyes, repeating fragments of songs, nursery rhymes, prayers, sounds that meant nothing to them anymore. All of them died within a month. Rau was sentenced to life in prison, but within 2 years, he vanished during a prison transfer. The official record said he died of pneumonia. Anna Weiss found no death certificate, no grave, and no witness account. It was as if he'd never existed. By the time she tried to publish her findings, she was warned to stop. 2 days later, her apartment was broken into, her research stolen. The only thing left untouched was a single Polaroid, a photo of her desk taken from inside the room. She lived the rest of her life in seclusion, insisting that Rau's work had continued under a new name, hidden behind psychiatric research. In 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, fragments of destroyed documents surfaced from a government archive. One file, partially burned, contained a chemical formula nearly identical to Rao's, labeled Project Somnus. Another folder listed test sites across Europe, one of them in Winden. Locals say the clinic still stands, boarded up and rotting, its windows blackened by soot. But sometimes if you shine a flashlight through the cracks, you can see something that shouldn't be there. A wall covered in photographs, perfectly preserved, faces staring out through the dust. And if you listen long enough, you might hear it. A faint click, like a camera shutter still going off in the dark. They called it the vanishing village of Ansel Creek. Though the name was later struck from most maps, erased like a smudge no one wanted to remember. But before it disappeared, Ansel Creek was a thriving mining settlement in rural Colorado, a place built on silver, sweat, and superstition. The last census, taken in 1908, listed 312 residents. By the spring of 1909, that number was 0. The official story claimed that a flood destroyed the town. But that wasn't true. There was no flood, no survivors, no graves, just silence. It began with a discovery. A narrow shaft beneath one of the mine tunnels, lined with smooth black stone, different from anything the miners had ever seen. When they broke through the rock, they found a small chamber, bone dry and perfectly circular, containing objects that didn't belong underground. Fragments of glass, small wooden carvings, and something like a child's doll made of wax. The miners brought them to the surface laughing, saying it was some old ritual thing from the tribes that lived there before. But that night, one of them, Daniel Morse, went missing. His boots were found standing upright beside his bed. His body was never recovered. Within a week, 3 more men vanished. The mine foreman sealed the tunnel, warning everyone to stay away. The town preacher called it punishment for disturbing the dead. The mayor called it nonsense. The next morning, the mayor's wife was found wandering the main street barefoot, covered in dust, whispering over and over, "We woke them up." Her mind never returned. Ansel Creek turned paranoid. Men carried rifles in their homes. Families began sleeping in groups, doors bolted, windows boarded. But it didn't help. Every night, someone vanished. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, just absence, people gone as though plucked out of existence. The town doctor, Elijah Dunn, kept a ledger of events. It's the only record that survived. His handwriting grew more frantic with each entry. April 3rd, another missing. Martha Rowe. Her husband swears she dissolved like dust in his arms. He's delirious. April 5th, heard movement under the floorboards. Sounds like breathing. April 9th, the walls whisper. I can't tell if it's the wind or if the mine has followed us home. April 13th, the earth hums at night. Something is under us. It's closer. The last entry is dated April 17th. They're not gone. They're just quieter now. Weeks later, a group of railway workers stumbled upon the outskirts of Ansel Creek. The town was empty, eerily preserved. Food sat on tables, fires smoldered in hearths, clocks still ticking. But no living soul remained. The ground felt strange beneath their boots, hollow, soft, like the earth was hiding something just beneath the surface. When authorities came, they dug for weeks and found nothing. Then, one evening, under the collapsed remains of the mine, they uncovered a chamber identical to the one the miners had broken into, only larger. Inside were 312 wax figures arranged in rows, each one eerily detailed. Some appeared to be in the middle of eating, some holding hands, some with expressions of terror frozen in their faces. The bodies of the missing, preserved, perfectly sculpted, except when they touched one it was warm. The figures began to soften under the miners' lanterns, their surfaces melting, collapsing into pools of pale wax. The workers fled. By morning, the chamber was gone, sealed by a fresh cave-in. The state declared Ansel Creek uninhabitable, citing unstable ground conditions. All records of the town were sealed by the Colorado State Board in 1910. The official explanation: landslide and toxic gas release. But in 1978, a team of surveyors rediscovered the site. Beneath the soil, they found remnants of the mine, and deep below, faint human impressions, as if hundreds of bodies had been pressed into the rock itself. Geological testing showed something impossible. The rock was organic, like petrified tissue. They stopped digging after that. Locals near the area claim that on cold nights, when the air is perfectly still, you can hear the faint tapping of pickaxes echoing from underground, followed by a sound like wet clay shifting, like something trying to unbury itself. No one knows what really happened in Ansel Creek, but every few decades, hikers report seeing strange waxy shapes forming in the dirt, faces that vanish when touched, mouths open as if trying to speak, whispering in voices that sound like the mountain itself is remembering the people it once consumed. They called it Operation White Silence, though for decades, no one outside of a handful of government archives even knew that phrase existed. It was born in the shadow of the Cold War, buried under the weight of bureaucratic secrecy and moral rot. What happened between 1952 and 1963 was meant to be erased, and for the most part, it was, except for a few boxes of film reels found in a forgotten storage facility in Nevada, labeled simply, "Do not develop." The story begins at the height of atomic testing, when the US government was desperate to understand not just the effects of radiation, but the long-term impact on human psychology, how fear itself could be weaponized. They called it behavioral containment research, but it was something else entirely. The first clue came from an unmarked airfield in the Nevada desert, where a handful of pilots were tasked with flying over restricted coordinates during nighttime hours. They were told they were testing new navigational equipment. Most never returned. The few who did described seeing white flashes on the ground that weren't explosions but shapes. Human shapes, luminous and still. The program expanded. Civilian volunteers were quietly recruited under the promise of national service. In reality, they were abducted test subjects, prisoners, asylum patients, drifters, anyone without family to notice they'd vanished. They were taken to a facility that didn't exist on any map, known only in redacted documents as Site Epsilon. Site Epsilon was built underground, hidden beneath a dried lake bed. Inside, hundreds of subjects were exposed to low doses of radiation, sleep deprivation, and sonic isolation. They were placed in white rooms. Rooms with no corners, no shadows, just light and sound that never stopped. The goal was to see how long a human mind could survive without darkness, without silence. Most lasted days, some lasted weeks. A few began to laugh, then scream, then fall silent. A man named Dr. Leon Carver oversaw the project. His reports, declassified decades later, read like the notes of a man unraveling. Subject 01 sees faces in the walls. Subject 032 insists she can hear color. Subject 059 asks for her own shadow back. They forget language first, then memory, then they forget they exist. By 1957, Carver's team had recorded something impossible. Several subjects had stopped responding to pain, food, or human interaction, but their vitals remained stable. They were alive, breathing, and conscious, but completely unresponsive. They sat motionless, eyes open, pupils dilated, skin pale and almost translucent. He called it psychogenic stasis, the human mind's ultimate defense mechanism against unbearable stimulus. The next phase of the experiment tried to reverse it. They exposed the silent subjects to increasing darkness, trying to bring them back from the void. What emerged wasn't human. On recovered film reels, you can see the white room. A man sits on a chair, motionless. Then the lights dim. His eyes flicker, mouth opens, and a sound begins, low at first, then rising to an inhuman pitch. Every light in the room explodes. When the cameras recover, the man is gone. The chair is empty. Carver wrote one final note before Site Epsilon was shut down. The mind does not return whole. It leaves fragments. The white takes the rest. The government denied everything. The facility was dismantled, documents shredded. But years later, during the Freedom of Information Act releases, fragments of Operation White Silence surfaced, enough to suggest it had continued under different names. Project Chorus, Operation Lumen, MK White. In 2003, a storm exposed part of an underground tunnel system 40 miles from the old test range. Explorers who ventured inside found walls coated in a fine white dust. At the end of one corridor was a single door with a faded warning: "Do not restore power." They did. The footage recovered from their camera, time-stamped for exactly 43 seconds, showed the room filling with light. A figure appeared in the center, sitting upright, facing the camera. Then the screen turned white and stayed that way. When police found the explorers' vehicle days later, all three were inside, sitting upright, eyes open, skin bleached to bone white. Their camera lay between them, still recording, the lens filled with static. Every file related to Site Epsilon vanished from the National Archives the following month. But sometimes researchers report that while scrolling through digital indexes, they'll see something strange. A blank entry marked Operation. When you click it, your screen turns white for exactly 43 seconds. They called it the Children of Room 34. Though, officially there was never any such room, and no such children. The story takes us to a hospital that doesn't exist on paper, one that operated for less than a decade before it was quietly shut down and erased from public record. But people remember, nurses talk, janitors whisper, and somewhere in the background of forgotten towns, there are still those who wake up at night hearing the faint sound of children humming a song that no one ever taught them. The place was called St. Aurelia's Orphan Asylum, built on the outskirts of Bristol, England, in 1959. The building had once been a Victorian sanatorium before it was repurposed for children displaced by post-war chaos. The staff was small, the funding minimal, and most of the records that survived were handwritten, faded, and incomplete. But one section stands out, a room that shouldn't have existed. The blueprints listed only 33 rooms. Yet a nurse's personal diary mentioned room 34 repeatedly, the special children's ward. According to her, it wasn't part of the main orphanage. It was in the basement, accessible only to senior medical staff. The diary, found decades later by a demolition crew, begins innocently. They moved 6 children down to room 34 today. Said they were special cases, fragile but gifted. Told us not to talk to them, only to deliver meals and leave quickly. A few days later, the entries darkened. They don't eat much. They hum together. Same tune, over and over. Sounds like a lullaby, but wrong somehow. The rhythm isn't natural. One of them stared at me through the door window for almost an hour. I could hear whispering, but none of them were speaking. The nurse stopped writing for weeks. When she resumed, her handwriting had changed. Shaky, uneven. They said not to go down there at night, but I heard crying. I went anyway. The hallway lights flickered. The crying stopped the moment I opened the door. All 6 children were standing in a circle. Their eyes, I don't know how to describe it. Like they were glowing, but only when they looked at each other. After that entry, the diary ends abruptly. When the asylum closed in 1968, official reports cited funding shortages and infrastructure failure. No mention of room 34. But in the archived blueprints recovered in 1984, there's a faint pencil marking, a square added to the basement level, unnumbered. A space where no doors should have been. In 1992, during renovation work, contractors unearthed that section. Behind a bricked-up doorway was a long corridor lined with murals drawn by children. Figures of people, animals, and shapes that looked like stars, except some had too many points, curling inward like spirals. At the end of the hall was room 34. The walls were lined with iron beds, each one strapped with leather restraints. On one wall, written in faded red paint, was a single phrase: "We sang them out." Forensics found traces of blood, hair, and human fingernails embedded in the floor. But there were no remains. Only 6 small indentations in the concrete, as though bodies had once lain there, long enough to leave impressions. Then came something stranger. A small metal box was discovered in the wall cavity containing 6 audio reels. Only one was intact. The recording begins with faint static, then the sound of a woman's voice, calm, deliberate. Session 47. The children exhibit coordinated responses to auditory stimulus. They no longer differentiate self from group. Their consciousness seems shared. Then silence. After 10 seconds, a low hum starts. It's soft at first, then layered. 6 distinct voices blending into one note. The tone rises, becomes dissonant, almost unbearable. At the 122 mark, there's a loud pop, and the tape cuts off. The reel was sent to the British Psychological Society for analysis. Within a week, it vanished. The man assigned to catalog it resigned, citing auditory hallucinations. He later claimed he could still hear the hum faintly when the world went quiet. In the hum of lights, the rhythm of fans, the static between radio channels. In 2007, urban explorers broke into the ruins of St. Aurelius. One of them recorded a short video, which appeared briefly online before being removed. It shows the basement hallway. The camera pans over the murals, the cracked plaster, the rusted beds. But when the camera turns toward the end of the corridor, the faint sound of humming starts. The walls begin to tremble slightly, dust falling from the ceiling. The video ends with the sound of children giggling. The explorer who uploaded it was found weeks later in his apartment, alive but unresponsive. Doctors described him as catatonic, with abnormal EEG activity matching the pattern of synchronized brainwaves. He was humming. Today, the site of St. Aurelius is a supermarket parking lot, but workers have reported strange issues with the electrical systems. Lights flicker. Speakers hum when the store is empty, and sometimes if you walk there late at night, you can hear faint singing coming from beneath the ground. 6 voices, perfectly in tune. In 1932, a freight train derailed in the forests outside Asheville, North Carolina. Local police assumed it was just another mechanical failure, the kind common during the Great Depression. But when rescuers reached the wreck, they found something no one could explain. The train's cargo manifest listed only industrial goods, yet every car was empty except one, a locked, steel-reinforced container that had been torn open from the inside. The story of what that train carried would later be erased from all records, and the men who worked that investigation, most of them, would disappear within months. Only one survivor, Deputy Samuel Crane, left behind a single note before vanishing himself. They told us to forget what we saw, but you can't forget the smell of something that was never supposed to breathe. It started weeks before the derailment, when the Fletcher Chemical Company began quietly purchasing large shipments of biological waste, glass tubing, and preservation agents. The company was a front, later traced to an abandoned government project called the Horus Initiative. Its purpose was buried under layers of classification, but one memo that survived referred to it as a study of interspecies cognitive grafting. Rumors spread about experiments with human and animal brain tissue, attempts to transfer instincts across species, allegedly for military use. It sounds impossible now, but those who saw the aftermath of the crash swore it was something far worse than a failed experiment. When the train derailed, witnesses from nearby farms said they heard screaming long before emergency crews arrived. Not human screaming, more like the sound of something that had never learned how to die properly. By the time the first responders reached the wreck, the steel container had already been breached. The door was bent outward, claw marks carved into the metal like something had tried to escape. They found 3 bodies nearby, all rail workers, but their deaths didn't make sense. Their eyes were gone, yet there was no sign of bleeding. The sockets were perfectly sealed over with thin layers of skin. One man's mouth was fused shut, lips melted together. The coroner called it rapid cellular deformation, something no one had ever seen before. Deputy Crane's report, now lost except for a single carbon copy, described what they found next. The woods were wrong. Everything was quiet, no birds, no wind. Just a smell like burnt meat and copper. Then we saw the tracks. They looked like footprints, but each print had more toes than it should have. 5 on one side, 7 on the other. Crane followed the trail with 4 men. Only one of them made it back to the scene. The survivor was incoherent, muttering about a hollow-faced thing that spoke with a voice like water in pipes. He later tore out his own tongue in the hospital. Within 48 hours, military vehicles arrived. The site was cordoned off. Workers were told to leave immediately, and anyone who mentioned the incident was visited by federal agents. Newspaper coverage of the derailment stopped after a single article. The Fletcher Chemical Company was dissolved within the month. But 2 years later, a pair of hunters found something deep in the woods near where the crash had occurred. A rusted steel hatch half buried in the ground. They pried it open and discovered a staircase leading down into a small chamber, flooded and stinking of chemicals. On the walls, painted in a thick black substance, were words that seemed scrawled in panic. They don't die, they remember. At the bottom of the chamber were several glass containers, most shattered. Inside one of the remaining jars floated what looked like a preserved human brain, except it pulsed faintly as if reacting to light. By the 1950s, whispers about the Horus Initiative re-emerged during a Senate inquiry into unethical experiments. One name appeared repeatedly, Dr. Eliza Horus, a neurologist whose private correspondence referenced sentient grafts and cellular cognition. She disappeared in 1932, the same year as the crash. Her final letter, written to a colleague, was never mailed. It was found in an attic decades later. We have crossed a line we cannot uncross. The tissue remembers. The cells listen. It knows when we look at it. We thought we were teaching it how to live, but it was learning us instead. When that letter surfaced, several researchers from the inquiry committee reportedly suffered identical symptoms: nosebleeds, hallucinations of breathing walls, and voices whispering through static. The letter was confiscated, the case closed. But in 2019, hikers exploring the Pisgah National Forest found a rusted freight plate bearing the number HX04, matching the lost train's manifest. Beneath it were fragments of glass cracked open like eggshells, and something else. Bones, not animal. Not human. Both. DNA analysis failed to produce any results. Every lab that tested the sample reported incompatible data corruption. One technician later told reporters, "The computer kept freezing every time we tried to process it, like it didn't want to be read." That area of forest has since been fenced off, officially listed as unstable ground. No one is supposed to go there anymore. But campers still say that if you're quiet at night, you can hear what sounds like lab equipment humming somewhere below the soil. Sometimes they say the earth itself seems to breathe. In 1974, a small Catholic orphanage in rural France called Maison des Champs was quietly shut down after an unexplained fire destroyed most of its eastern wing. The official report called it a tragic electrical accident, a short circuit that claimed the lives of 6 children and 1 nun. But when the rubble was cleared, investigators discovered something deeply unsettling. The wiring system had been cut cleanly in multiple places, and the flames had started from the inside of the walls. The case should have ended there, but one local journalist named René Vallier refused to let it go. He began looking into the orphanage's history, tracing its records back through the church archives. That's when he found something strange. Maison des Champs wasn't listed as an orphanage until 1961, but its building had existed long before that, under a different name, Institut de Résonance Cognitive. Translated, it meant the Institute of Cognitive Resonance. It had been a research facility during the Nazi occupation, conducting experimental education on children who had survived wartime trauma. The institute's director was a man named Dr. Lucien Duhamel, a neurologist obsessed with what he called collective echo theory, the belief that extreme emotional experiences could be imprinted onto sound frequencies, and that children, being more receptive, could store these echoes unconsciously. When Vallier tried to find out what had happened to Duhamel, he discovered that all post-war records of the man had been erased. No grave, no photographs, no surviving family. But what was stranger was that several of the orphanage's nuns, when asked about the history of the building, became visibly shaken. One of them, Sister Madeline, said only, "We were told to never sing the old hymns." Not after the night of the voices. There were no recordings of that night, only fragments of testimony from surviving orphans who had been relocated after the fire. They spoke of hearing songs that weren't songs, voices that didn't belong to anyone they knew, echoing through the halls long after lights out. One boy said the voices came from the walls. Another swore that when he covered his ears, he could still hear them inside his head. Valier dug deeper. In a dusty archive in Lyon, he found one surviving document from the original institute, a half-burned reel-to-reel tape labeled Subject 47. It contained less than a minute of audio, but that minute was chilling. The tape began with a high-pitched hum, followed by faint breathing. Then came the sound of children humming a simple melody. Slowly, their pitch began to distort, voices overlapping, forming impossible harmonics that made the air itself seem to tremble. At the end of the tape, a man's voice can be heard saying, "They're remembering again." 2 days after listening to the tape, Valier stopped answering his phone. His apartment was later found ransacked, typewriter still on, a half-finished sentence on the page. The walls hum at night. "I think they're..." and then nothing. His body was never found. When new ownership took over the ruins of Maison des Champs in 1981, reconstruction halted after workers reported hearing whispers through the plaster when drilling. Several quit. One laborer claimed to have heard a child laughing behind the bricks. The renovation company sealed the site, abandoning it entirely. Locals now call it La Maison qui Chante, the house that sings. In 2006, urban explorers broke into the structure, filming their descent into the cellar. Their video, later uploaded anonymously, shows a narrow staircase and a set of rusted iron doors. As they approach, faint singing can be heard, a wordless lullaby echoing faintly in the distance. The explorers open the doors and step into a large, circular room lined with old speakers and microphones. In the center lies a decayed reel-to-reel recorder. When one of them presses play, a wave of static fills the room, and then the sound of a choir. The same haunting hum that Valier had heard decades earlier. The camera begins to shake. Someone yells that the walls are vibrating. Then the footage cuts out. The explorers' bodies were found the next day outside the property, all three of them, kneeling in a semicircle, faces turned upward, mouths open. Their throats were raw, as if they had been singing for hours. Authorities labeled it carbon monoxide poisoning, but their audio equipment, recovered at the scene, was still running. The final seconds captured the faint echo of children's voices singing softly, accompanied by another sound beneath it, the hum of an adult voice whispering in rhythm. When slowed down, experts said the whisper formed coherent words. They remember the fire. To this day, Maison des Champs remains sealed by the French government. Locals say on certain nights, if you walk close enough to the ruins, you can hear faint hymns coming from beneath the ground, like a choir trying to remember a song it was never meant to finish. In 1987, a government records clerk in Warsaw stumbled upon a box misfiled deep within the Ministry of Health archives. It was small, unmarked, and filled with damp folders that smelled faintly of mildew and formaldehyde. Inside were a series of reports stamped with the insignia of a defunct Soviet-era laboratory, K-12 Psychological Conditioning Division. The reports referred repeatedly to something called the Narva program. At first glance, it looked like just another Cold War experiment in propaganda or brainwashing. But buried among the paperwork was a handwritten note that changed everything. Do not play the recordings without soundproofing. Subjects experience auditory hallucinations that spread. The Narva program had been conducted between 1961 and 1964 in a remote psychiatric hospital near the Estonian border. Officially, it was meant to study neural entrainment, the synchronization of human brainwaves through auditory frequency exposure. In reality, the program was designed to test how sound could erase memory, identity, and even moral inhibition. The recordings used in the experiments were composed of low-frequency tones, layered with speech fragments in multiple languages. The tapes were nicknamed the Black Lullabies. Every subject exposed to them for more than 20 minutes began to exhibit identical symptoms: disorientation, inability to recognize faces, uncontrollable weeping, and eventually, the compulsion to repeat certain phrases whispered within the recordings. Those phrases differed slightly each time, as if the words were changing themselves. The experiment's lead scientist, Dr. Irina Karlenko, believed she could use the lullabies to reset human consciousness, to wipe away trauma and rebuild the mind. But her personal diary, found among the documents, painted a darker picture. The voices beneath the sound are not ours. The machines record what we never played. The subjects speak before they are asked to. Sometimes they speak in my voice. By early 1963, more than 50 patients had been exposed. Only 3 survived longer than 6 months. One of them, a young soldier named Pavel, became the center of the investigation after the program abruptly shut down. Pavel's post-experiment evaluation described something beyond psychosis. He stares into mirrors for hours, claiming he can see another version of himself mouthing words ahead of his own speech. When restrained, he begins humming at exactly 6 hertz, a tone not audible to most humans, but felt as vibration. Other patients respond to it involuntarily. In June of that year, Dr. Karlenko and her staff were ordered to destroy all materials related to the Narva program. They didn't. Instead, they buried the magnetic tapes beneath the hospital basement, sealing them inside concrete containers. Weeks later, the facility caught fire. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, the report noted something else. All windows shattered inward simultaneously. Several bodies were found seated upright, eyes open, mouths burned shut from the inside. The program disappeared into Cold War rumor until that clerk found the box in 1987. He handed it to his supervisor. Within 24 hours, both men were found dead in their apartments, radios still turned on, each tuned to static. The discovery of those deaths sparked a quiet panic in the ministry. Every surviving document related to the Narva program was recalled, shredded, or neutralized. But one cassette copy of the Black Lullabies had already been taken by a private researcher named Lukasz Drozd, who specialized in lost Cold War media. In 1991, Drozd uploaded an article to an underground academic forum describing his attempt to digitize the recording. He noted that every time he played it, the waveform changed slightly, as if the audio was mutating. He wrote, "The file corrupts itself when copied. It doesn't want to exist twice." 2 days later, Drozd's post vanished. So did he. His apartment was found with all electronic devices melted from the inside out, though there was no sign of fire. On the wall above his desk, someone had written a sentence in Russian: "Do not remember what you hear." In 2004, a journalist working for a Polish magazine claimed to have received a CD-ROM labeled Narva 03 in the mail. It contained a short clip, just under a minute, of faint voices layered under a tone. She described hearing a child's laughter, then a whisper saying her name. When she replayed it, the whisper said something different. "We're still inside." She suffered a seizure while writing her article. Her colleague finished it for her, omitting the tape's audio. But those who read her drafts said she'd typed the same sentence over and over for nearly 3 pages. They made sound remember pain. Today, the ruins of the old psychiatric hospital still stand, fenced off and patrolled. Locals call it the place where echoes live. Some swear that on quiet nights, if the wind passes through the old vents just right, you can hear a faint lullaby, always changing, always humming the same impossible tone. No one dares to record it anymore. Those who tried say their equipment won't play back what they captured. It plays something else instead, something that knows your name. In 1959, a mining town called Carrow's Hollow disappeared from every official map of West Virginia. Its population, 312 people, was quietly relocated, or so the records claimed. There were no photographs of the evacuation, no government statements, and no surviving census data after that year. To this day, Caro's Hollow is listed in state archives as decommissioned for geological instability. But according to a retired state surveyor named Henry Belden, who had worked the area that same year, there was no landslide, no contamination, and no natural disaster. What happened, he said before his death in 1998, wasn't something nature could have done. Caro's Hollow had been built around a massive coal mine that stretched for miles beneath the Appalachian foothills. The company that ran it, Hess and Dawes Mining Co., was known for pushing production far past safety limits. By 1958, they had dug tunnels deeper than any mine in the region, and according to Belden's surviving notes, one shaft had broken into something that wasn't rock. He described it as a hollow vein of clay, soft like wet skin, running horizontally beneath the lowest level. When workers cut into it, their drills made no sound. The vibration just stopped. One miner, Earl Whitcomb, reportedly said it felt like drilling into silence. A week later, the first disappearance happened. Then another. By January 1959, entire night shifts were vanishing underground. The company blamed cave-ins, but the tunnels showed no collapse. Tools were found still running, food uneaten, cigarettes still burning where men had left them. It was Whitcomb's wife, Martha, who first reported the return. She said Earl had come back to their home one evening, covered in dust but completely calm. He sat at the kitchen table, said nothing, and just stared at her. When she tried to touch him, his skin was cold and soft, like wax. The next morning he was gone again. Her account was dismissed as hysteria until others reported the same. Men returned from the mines days or weeks after disappearing, wordless, expressionless, moving only when spoken to, and then only mimicking the speaker's tone. They didn't eat. They didn't sleep. And after several days, they'd vanish again, leaving behind a residue described as gray dust mixed with black oil. By February, the town's school teacher, Miss Evelyn Crane, began documenting the events in a journal later recovered by Belden. "They don't cast shadows," she wrote, "and at night I can hear them beneath the floorboards, digging, whispering. Sometimes they speak in my voice." State officials finally intervened after the local pastor, Father Alcott, organized a prayer vigil that ended in tragedy. Half the congregation went missing during the service. Witnesses said the church floor buckled like soft clay, and when rescuers dug through the debris, there was nothing below. Just a perfectly smooth cavity descending into blackness. The next morning, soldiers arrived. They ordered everyone out of Caro's Hollow by sundown. Belden, tasked with mapping the unstable terrain, watched as the military sealed the mine entrances with concrete and detonated charges to collapse the tunnels. But that night, he and another engineer saw lights moving beneath the ground, glowing shapes drifting through the earth like lanterns in water. He tried to report it. His supervisors told him to stop asking questions. Weeks later, Caro's Hollow was erased from federal maps. Every reference to it in county records was redacted. But in 1972, during a flood that struck the nearby town of Riverton, part of the old hillside collapsed, exposing the top of one of the sealed tunnels. Rescue crews searching for missing people found a passage still intact. Inside, they discovered old helmets, tools, and something else. Perfectly smooth impressions of human figures pressed into the walls, as if bodies had been absorbed by the stone itself. The discovery was never publicized. The tunnel was resealed, and the site was reclassified as contaminated ground. But a year later, strange reports began coming from Riverton. People heard knocking sounds coming from their basements. Low rhythmic thuds, like mining strikes. One resident claimed that when he put his ear to the wall, he could hear someone breathing on the other side. By the 1980s, the phenomenon had become local folklore. Parents told children not to dig too deep in the soil near the old ridge. They called the noises the Hollow Men. But those who lived closest to the ridge swore that sometimes, late at night, the knocking stopped, replaced by the faint sound of voices calling from underground. In 1998, a documentary crew investigating the story found one of the old access tunnels by accident. Their footage, recovered from a damaged camera, shows them descending into a narrow shaft lined with smooth, pulsing walls. One of the crew says, "It's breathing." Then a sound, 3 dull knocks, echoes from deeper inside. Moments later, the light flickers. The camera tilts, catching a glimpse of something moving through the clay, something that looks like a human silhouette pressing out from the inside. Its mouth open, whispering in a hoarse voice, "Don't dig." The footage cuts off there. The crew is never found. To this day, the U.S. Geological Survey database contains a blank entry for that region, marked simply Zone C59, Access Restricted, Unstable Strata. Locals say that on quiet nights, if you stand near the ridge and tap 3 times on the ground, something will tap back. In 1924, the village of Beldam Creek, Maine, vanished without warning. It had been home to roughly 200 people, mostly fishermen, farmers, and their families, living around a narrow, fog-shrouded inlet. One spring morning, the mail carrier found the entire settlement deserted. Houses stood open, food half-eaten, fires still burning in stoves. Livestock wandered the dirt roads. Not a single person remained. The official explanation, later buried in state archives, was mass relocation due to economic hardship. But there were no records of migration, no sale of property, and no indication that the villagers had taken their belongings. It was as if the town had been plucked out of time. Decades later, a historian named Elias Morton uncovered fragments of what might have happened. In the town's abandoned church, buried beneath collapsed beams, he found a locked chest containing journals, hand-drawn maps, and something stranger, a stack of weathered hymn sheets with lyrics written in a language that didn't match any known dialect. The earliest journal, dated 1899, belonged to Reverend Alistair Wren, the church's founder. At first, his writings were typical, accounts of services, births, and baptisms. But as the years went on, they grew darker. He wrote of recurring dreams in which he heard the sea speaking back. He began referring to something called the still tide, a phrase that appeared dozens of times throughout his entries. The tide comes in without sound now. The water moves but makes no noise. The children say they can hear whispers in the foam. By 1915, the tone of the journal shifted from religious devotion to obsession. The Reverend believed the ocean itself was alive, an ancient consciousness that remembered everything that ever touched it. He began conducting strange tide rituals, submerging himself for hours during low tide, claiming he could hear confessions carried on the current. One entry read, "The water has learned to listen. Soon it will answer." The villagers began to complain of odd phenomena. Fish washing ashore already gutted, crabs crawling in perfect circles, and, most disturbingly, voices echoing through the fog when no boats were near. Some swore they saw figures standing on the water's surface at dawn, motionless and silent. In late 1923, the journal entries abruptly stopped. But one final note, scrawled in the margin of the last page, said, "The tide will take us home." Morton also discovered records of multiple telegraph messages sent from Beldam Creek in the weeks before the disappearance. Most were incoherent. One, sent to the nearest coastal station, read, "The sea is full of names. They are calling themselves." That message was logged at 3:47 a.m. on March 12, 1924, the last time the village was ever heard from. Morton, fascinated and disturbed, began organizing an expedition to the site, which by then had been reclaimed by the forest. When he arrived in 1979, the remains of the village were little more than moss-covered foundations. But near the shoreline, he found something impossible. The sand had hardened into smooth, glass-like stone, shaped in perfect circular ripples. Embedded within it were hundreds of impressions, bare footprints leading straight into the water, never returning. That night, Morton recorded audio notes describing what he saw. His final tape, labeled Tide Session 4, contains the sound of distant waves and his trembling voice. "There's no wind, but the fog's moving. I can hear them. Not the sea, not waves, voices. They're under the surface. I can't tell what they're saying, but I think they're calling names. Then, faintly, another voice, female, distant, can be heard on the recording, repeating his name twice before the tape cuts off. Morton's boat washed ashore 2 days later, empty. His camera film was overexposed, except for one photograph, the church bell of Beldam Creek, lying on the beach, half buried in salt. Its surface appeared melted, as if it had been submerged in something hotter than fire. Modern geologists who examined the coastline found unusual seismic readings beneath the bay, a steady rhythmic pulse emanating from deep underwater, repeating every 47 minutes. When hydrophones were lowered, they recorded a faint, human-like chorus echoing through the depths. The sound pattern repeated phrases in tonal sequences that, when slowed down, resembled speech. Marine linguists later tried to interpret it. One fragment, translated phonetically, sounded like, "We remember the shore." After those findings, the study was abruptly discontinued. Funding was withdrawn. All samples collected from Beldam Creek were seized by federal authorities under environmental jurisdiction. The research team was instructed to destroy all backups of their recordings. Locals near the old coastline say that the bay never stays calm for long. On certain nights when the fog rolls in heavy, the tide stops moving altogether. The air grows thick, the waves freeze mid-motion, and you can hear a soft humming, like hundreds of voices singing beneath the water. They say if you stand too close to the edge and whisper your name, the sea will whisper it back, but only once. In 1948, a train bound for Berlin disappeared between two checkpoints. The event was officially classified as a wartime logistical anomaly, but witnesses, documents, and one surviving telegraph suggest something much stranger happened. Something deliberately erased. The train, designated Freight 77, left Warsaw at 3:22 a.m., carrying confiscated wartime artifacts, paintings, and documents seized by retreating forces. Its manifest listed 32 crates labeled only as cultural materials, restricted. A handful of soldiers and one railway engineer accompanied the cargo. The train was scheduled to arrive in Berlin within 12 hours. It never did. At 7:14 a.m., a signalman at the Königsbrück checkpoint confirmed its passage. The train's headlight cut through the morning mist, and he recorded the standard signal exchange. But when he looked back moments later, the tracks behind the rear carriage were empty. No sound, no smoke, no sign of derailment, just cold rails glinting in the frost. The incident triggered an immediate military search. They traced the line for 50 miles in both directions, expecting to find wreckage, sabotage, anything. Nothing. Not a single piece of debris. Even the locomotive's heat signature vanished abruptly from the line's thermal log, as if it had been switched off mid-motion. For decades, Freight 77 became a whispered legend, dubbed the Vanishing Train. Most dismissed it as a myth born of post-war confusion. But in 1989, an archivist named Lieselotte Brun uncovered a misfiled envelope in the East German State Archives. Inside was a weathered telegram, dated the same morning the train disappeared. It read, "Signal repeating from Freight 77. Operator says we are not on the right track. Tracks wrong. Terrain wrong. Snow looks red. Engine not responding. God help us." That message was never officially logged. Brun's investigation revealed that one of the train's listed guards, Captain Marcus Heindel, had been reassigned from an experimental division involved in psychogeographic research, a secret post-war effort to map the effects of extreme electromagnetic fields on human perception. The theory was that certain areas of the Earth emitted spatial anomalies, zones where time and orientation fractured under pressure. Heindel's division was working on using those fields to conceal transport routes. In other words, they were experimenting with making things, or people, disappear from radar entirely. A week before the train's departure, internal memos described an unauthorized activation of a field test near the very line Freight 77 used. Engineers were ordered to calibrate containment generators. The memo ends abruptly with the line, "Field distortion remains active." Avoid transit through Sector 14B until magnetic decay verified. Sector 14B corresponded exactly to the stretch of track where the train vanished. In 1993, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Brun was granted temporary access to restricted Soviet archives. There she found surveillance photos taken in Poland in 1962, 14 years after the disappearance. They showed a dense patch of forest in the Sudeten foothills. In one photo, buried under moss and trees, was what looked unmistakably like the rusted nose of a locomotive. On its side, barely legible, were the faded numerals, 77. When a recovery team arrived weeks later, they found the area empty. The forest floor was disturbed, the trees scorched in a perfect semicircle as though something had pressed down from above, then lifted away. Soil samples taken from the site showed anomalous radiation, decaying at a rate inconsistent with any known isotope. By then, Brun's health had begun to fail. In her final recorded interview, she claimed she had seen something that made her abandon the case altogether. "I was cataloging an old ministry file," she said. "There was a photo, a group of men standing beside the missing train. Only one of them was me, older, much older, holding the envelope that led me to the file." The interviewer laughed nervously. Brun didn't. "It was dated 1948, she said softly, the year the train disappeared. That file and the photograph she described were never located again." In 2011, a team of railway historians hiking near the same region stumbled upon a collapsed tunnel sealed by concrete. It bore no markings on modern maps. Using ground-penetrating radar, they detected a massive metallic object buried within, extending the length of 12 cars. When they returned days later with excavation permits, the tunnel had flooded overnight. The water was black, viscous, and carried an electrical charge strong enough to disable their equipment. Locals who live near the Sudeten Pass still tell stories of hearing a train whistle echo through the mountains on winter nights, though no active rail lines exist there anymore. One shepherd reported seeing faint light between the trees, a string of windows glowing pale yellow, drifting slowly through the fog before vanishing behind the pines. Sometimes, they say, if you stand by the old tracks and press your ear to the frozen rail, you can still hear the low hum of an engine passing by. Not in this world, maybe, but somewhere parallel to it. A loop that never ends. A route that was never meant to be taken, carrying ghosts of a past that refused to arrive. In 1961, deep in the heart of Louisiana, a small town called Eddington Parish became the site of one of the most disturbing disappearances in American history. One that was methodically erased from newspapers, police archives, and public records within a single week. The few fragments that remain were pieced together decades later from forgotten court transcripts and a single reel of damaged film. The story begins with Dr. Marjorie Leland, a local psychologist who ran a private rehabilitation facility called The Haven. The facility was known for treating traumatized children and teenagers, mostly runaways or kids whose families had been torn apart by the aftershocks of the post-war years. By all accounts, Dr. Leland was well respected, articulate, and even beloved by many of her patients. But what no one in Eddington Parish knew was that the Haven had no medical accreditation. Its staff consisted of only 3 nurses, none licensed to practice psychiatry, and buried in its founding charter was a cryptic line under funding sources, Private Initiative 43B. In November 1961, the parents of a 14-year-old boy named Samuel Gray filed a missing persons report. Samuel had been sent to the Haven 2 months prior for what his parents described as melancholic fits and violent sleepwalking. The facility claimed he'd run away during a storm, but when the sheriff's office pressed for details, the staff couldn't explain how the boy had escaped through barred windows and locked doors. The sheriff, William Hobbs, decided to conduct a search of the grounds. What he found was a sprawling basement beneath the main building, accessible only by a locked metal hatch covered with stacks of patient files. The room below was lined with old iron beds, restraints, and walls carved with symbols and words written backward. In the corner, an 8mm film projector sat on a table. The reel inside was labeled Cognitive Reintegration, Subject 12. The footage, though mostly silent, showed several children seated around a blackboard. Dr. Leland stood before them, holding what appeared to be a metronome. As it ticked, she repeated phrases in a calm, rhythmic voice. Memory is noise. The self must be emptied. The vessel must forget before it can be healed. One by one, the children began to echo her, their voices overlapping until it was impossible to tell them apart. At one point, the film catches a flicker of the boy's face, Samuel's, eyes vacant, mouth moving soundlessly. When Sheriff Hobbs confronted Dr. Leland about the footage, she insisted it was part of a therapeutic experiment designed to treat trauma by repatterning memory. She claimed that Initiative 43B was a federally funded program studying neurological resilience under hypnotic stress. But the local authorities never found any record of such a program. The day after the questioning, the haven burned to the ground. No one saw Dr. Leland leave, but her car was found abandoned 15 miles away, its trunk filled with reels of film and patient records, all doused in gasoline. The remains of at least 9 children were later recovered from the basement ruins. Their skulls showed evidence of surgical incisions consistent with experimental lobotomies. Samuel's body was never found. A week after the fire, Eddington Parish was visited by men in unmarked suits who ordered all surviving documents to be surrendered for national security reasons. Newspaper reporters who attempted to cover the case received anonymous threats. Within a month, local archives no longer contained any record of the haven's existence. The town fell silent about it. The grounds were bought by a private company and sealed off. But in 1982, a filmmaker named James Dowling, researching Cold War psychological experiments, uncovered a single fragment of a Department of Defense memo. It referenced Behavioral Reclamation Program 43B, listing the Haven Institute, Eddington Parish, Louisiana as a terminated test site. Dowling's discovery reignited interest, until he vanished 3 weeks later while driving to Baton Rouge for an interview. His car was later found submerged in the Atchafalaya River. In 1994, a hunter exploring restricted property near the former Haven grounds found a small, rusted box lodged in the mud. Inside were 3 Polaroids, aged, water-damaged, but still legible. Each depicted a group of children standing in front of a blackboard. In the last image, written in chalk above their heads, were the words, "The self erased is the self reborn." The next day, the hunter was found dead in his cabin. Officially, it was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But neighbors reported that before his death, he'd told them he heard a ticking sound, echoing through the woods every night, as though a metronome was still beating somewhere underground. Locals say the area remains unnaturally quiet. Birds avoid the trees near the old foundation. At night, people claim to hear children's voices, not crying, not screaming, but reciting something in unison in a tone so flat it sounds mechanical. "Memory is noise," they whisper. The self must be emptied. Some say Dr. Marjorie Leland was seen years later under a new name, working as a consultant for a defense contractor in Maryland. Others insist she never escaped the basement, that the fire wasn't a destruction, it was a cover. The state of Louisiana officially lists the Haven as a lost record, but among those who study erased crimes and hidden experiments, it has another name. They call it the Orphan Factory. Which of these forgotten crimes chilled you the most? The train that vanished? The children who were erased? Or the secrets that never made it to daylight? Some stories die in the dark because someone wanted them to. Others keep whispering, waiting to be found again. Tell us which one you can't stop thinking about in the comments below. For more real cases they tried to bury, subscribe, and stay tuned. Because where truth fades, the real horror begins.